Hi, welcome to section 3 of the course. In this section, we will learn some concepts like networking, recycler views, and fragments. So I have this JSON which is uploaded on my Firebase app, and it has a list of names of customers and their home addresses. So what we are going to try to do is we are trying to build a simple app which will display their names and their username in a list. For this list, we will be using recycler view, and for the functionality and to build the functionality, we'll be using MVVM or Model View ViewModel pattern. Now, knowing this pattern will help you learn the code that has been written by other developers in existing projects, and it can also help you write clean code when working with Android projects. Before we start, a little bit more about MVVM. MVVM stands for Model View ViewModel, where model holds the data which can come from a local data source or remote data source or both. And then we have the view, which is your final UI. In our case, it will be the fragment, which will use a recycler view to display all the names. And then finally, you have an intermediary called the view model, which might be using live data or RxJava or some normal Java callbacks to observe the changes which are happening in the model and to then send the response to the view so that the data can be rendered. It can also consume events coming from the view and then send the request back to the repository to fetch new data or update the data on the backend or the local data source. So a little bit complicated for beginners, but as we implement it, this might get more clear to you. So we'll be using live data, and for the networking part, we'll be using a third-party library called Retrofit. So come back to your Android Studio and then go to New, File, New Project. Choose the empty activity. Give the name. So this is just a simple customer list app. And then keep the language as Kotlin. Then click Finish. So this should open up a new window. You can close your old Thumbfight app. So let it build for first time so that everything is ready. So the app initial build is done. The first thing that we need to do is we need to go and add the internet permission. Every app on Android that communicates over the network to another backend server or anywhere needs this permission so that Android will allow this app to create network connections to the server. So once done, the job of manifest is over. The next thing that we do is we add the libraries. So as mentioned earlier, we'll be using a library called Retrofit for the networking part, and we will also need to add recycler view because it is bundled as part of Jetpack extension and not available as part of Android SDK. So this code is available in the description. You can either copy it from there or from the GitHub project. Because our data is available as JSON on the server, we'll be using Google library called Gson to help us parse that JSON. Now, next thing we need is the recycler view. So once you have added your libraries in the build Gradle, this is the build Gradle under the module and not the project level. This is the module level build Gradle. You can click here on sync now. If you're adding these libraries for the first time, it might take some time for the libraries to be downloaded and then your project to be built. Okay, so once our libraries are added, the first thing that we need is the data class. But before we start adding our classes, let us first create a package called customers, which will act as a feature package for the feature that we are adding. So customers, and then we'll add model. Now click on new and then Kotlin file/class, choose the class and write customer. So this is the data class, which means that this class will exclusively be used as the entity or the POJO in Java to hold the customers after we parse them from the JSON response. So in data class, we only need the initial constructor where we can define all the member variables. We will also be using this property from Gson, which will help us link our member variables to the JSON values. So if you see here, I have created a new member variable called username, and I have given an annotation serialized name with the value capital U user, capital N name. Now if I go back to the JSON, I can see that username is defined with this string. So I'm mapping this key to my username variable. This will help Gson identify which variable it has to set. Now the serialized name is optional. If your variable name is same as the key, then you don't have to mention the serialized name. But make sure to enter this data class as part of ProGuard so that these member variables are not encrypted and the names are not changed before this APK is sent to the user. Let us add first name, middle name, and last name also. Okay, so our data class is ready. This is the class that we will use to store the data once it has been passed from the JSON. Next thing we need is the code that will actually fetch this data from the internet or from our server. So for that, we will create another package where we can define the retrofit service. If you guys are not familiar about retrofit, I would suggest you to go and read about. So this is a third-party library provided by SquareUp, and it is used to simplify the process of fetching JSON or any kind of response from the server for Android projects. So you can see first thing that it needs is a service interface, and then we need to build the retrofit class using a base URL, and then finally we will use these calls to fetch our users, or in our case customers. So I've created the service package. Now I will create the interface. I will name it customer service. So here I just need to write the path or the relative path. I don't need to write the full URL. This helps us in two ways so that we don't have to change the code every time we are testing with another servers, and it also helps to make the code much more readable. So I just define a method called customers list, which will use the retrofit call to return us a list of customers. Okay, so our service definition is done. Next thing we need is a repository. As shown to you earlier, we will use the repository to help communicate with the network, and this will be our bottommost layer of the MVVM pattern that we are following. So for now, because we don't have a local storage, we will just be using a network repository. We will also create a private constant which will hold the base URL for us. So please ensure that you put the slash here, because in our service definition there is no slash. So please remember to add the slash in the base URL. Once we have defined the base URL, we can actually define our retrofit. So we are trying to do two things here. We are adding a base URL with our constant that we have defined on the top, and then we are also adding a converter factory which comes from Gson. This is the Google library that we are using to parse the JSON directly from the server response to our customer class. Finally, we need a member variable, a private member variable to hold the customer service. So we have defined a network repository and it has been linked to Retrofit Service to help it fetch the data from the particular base URL and the related path. Now, next thing we need is a live data to help it expose it to the view model. So if you remember, we are building this remote data source. We are using a network repository to directly fetch the data from this remote data source. And then we will have to expose this live data to help the view model observe the changes or even start the request to fetch the customer list. So let us then define So we have defined a private member variable called customer list, which is a mutable live data, which means that it will allow us to set the value once we have fetched it over the network. So next thing that we need is a method which will help us fetch the customer list. This is the method that will be invoked by the view model at the start to help the network repository start fetching this data. So we will just add a anonymous method here. You can see there is an error. We need to implement some member variables. Just select both. Say OK. In failure, we will just print the stack trace, which will be available in the logcat to see what has gone wrong. And in the method for all response, we will first check whether the response is successful. If the response is not successful, we will log it. This will help us track what went wrong, just in case our response does not come as expected. If the response is successful and the response.body is not null, we will set it to our customer list live data. So the final thing that we need is to expose this mutable live data. So you can see, even though we have defined the live data as mutable live data, we are only exposing live data so that the UI or the view model who is accessing this live data should not be allowed to set the value or change the value. They can only get the value. So with this, our network repository is ready. We have defined and connected it with our retrofit service. We have also defined the live data that will be exposed, and we have written a method which will allow view model to tell the network repository to start fetching the customer list. And we've also handled the failure and unsuccessful case. So next thing that we need is the view model. This is the intermediate layer in our MVVM pattern. Let us get a new package, view model, and then a Kotlin class called the customer view model. So our customer view model will extend from Android X lifecycle view model. Here again, we will define a private variable which will initialize and hold the repository. And we will define a method that can be called from the UI to start loading the customer list. So once the UI calls this method, we will fetch the customer list, and then we will also return the live data which has been initialized by the repository. So you might be wondering that the fetch is happening asynchronously and it might not finish before we call the next line, but that is okay. Whenever the list of customer is fetched, this onResponse method is called, and as soon as we set the value, this live data observe method will get triggered and the UI will get a response that some new data is available. So our view model and network repository is ready. So we have done this bottom part. Let us break this video here, and in the next video, we will work on the UI and build a fragment and a recycler view to get to parse and make sense of this data and then finally display it in the UI. See you there.